It's a pleasure for me to be here to introduce the introducer of the speaker. And it feels a little serendipitous because it's not every quarter I get to introduce both Rebecca Seligman and then thereafter, I flipped it, I should say, to introduce Thom McDade and then his better half, Rebecca Seligman. Rebecca, I hope you're listening. Thom is an amazing scholar who's really emblematic of the work that we do at IPR, which is linking science to policy. He's ticked all those boxes. He has lots of letters. He's members of lots of societies with lots of letters. So you know he's really important. But on a personal note, it's really, Thom is probably why I'm here today. I mean, I did his Biomarkers Institute many moons ago. That shaped my science. And then when sort of it happened, now Julius and I are here. So Thom's kind of like the midwife of the Young Lux clan. So thanks for that. You can tell the importance of a person by how many people are introducing the person who then introduces them. So we have a very important speaker today. Looking forward to hearing from Jessica, but first I'll pass the mic to Thom.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very kind. I'm very proud to be a midwife for the Lux clan. Look forward to catching up with you all soon. So it's my pleasure to be here and sort of introduce this topic, and Jessica Polos is going to do the heavy lifting here, and she's leading our group in this research effort on structural racism. So Jessica has her BA in anthropology and international relations from Urbana-Champaign. Then she went on to get a master's in public policy from the Harris School. And then she went on to get a PhD in sociology from Madison. And there she affiliated with the Centers for Demography and Ecology and Demography of Health and Aging. She joined our group in the summer of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. I was recruiting a postdoc and we got connected. And this is, I think, the third time we've actually met in person. So I'm looking forward to more in-person exchanges, and you'll see why shortly. I want to introduce the rest of the research team as well. Oops. This has been just a wonderful team science and collaborative effort. And so Jessica is leading us in the structural racism direction. But Stephanie Koning, who many of you know has been a postdoc through IPR with me since 2018. She's in social epi and demography, and she's now funded through her own NRSA F32 fellowship. Chiara Kershaw is a faculty associate of IPR and associate professor in preventive medicine. She's done some really important work on race-based inequities in health with a focus on neighborhoods and neighborhood disadvantage and cardiovascular risk. And then Taylor Hargrove is an assistant professor of sociology at UNC Chapel Hill and affiliated with the Carolina Population Center there. She's a core member of the team that's implementing the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which will feature in our conversation today. And she's also done really important work on structural racism, particularly from an intersectional perspective. So we're delighted that she was willing to join our team when we've co-opted her into this effort. And I think she may be online with us today. All right, so I'm just going to set this up a little bit, then I'm going to hand it off to Jessica. The murder of George Floyd shocked many of us, but not many people in communities of color, unfortunately. So summer of 2020, you may recall the killing of George Floyd by the police and many other Black Americans catalyzed a series of protests nationally and internationally. And one upside of all of that is it really catalyzed a reckoning and an awareness of the level of oppression and discrimination against people of color in the United States. Now, in sort of a history of science perspective, it's been more than 100 years that social biomedical scientists have been documenting the effects of race on health, racial differences in health, with a particular focus within a more social science orientation on racism as a determinant of health. So we can go back to the foundational work of W.E.B. Du Bois in 1899 with a really important study in Philadelphia documenting the effects of concentrated disadvantage on race-based differences in health. And that has continued to this day. And for about the past 25 years, there's been a primary focus, again, within more of a social epi tradition and a social science and even public health orientation on interpersonal discrimination as a prime pathway that links race and racism to a wide range of health outcomes. So about 25 years ago, David Williams, who's pictured here, and James Jackson in Michigan. Williams is now at Harvard. Williams unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. They developed an everyday discrimination scale, which is now widely used, has been widely used for the past 2.5 decades now. And it exists in various forms, but this is the original. And it basically asks a research participant to volunteer that they felt like they were treated poorly, without courtesy, without respect in various domains of their lives. And that gets tallied up. And then that is a score that's used to predict blood pressure, mortality, adverse birth outcomes. And it's a very important paradigm that has really documented the widespread impacts of racial discrimination on a really wide range of health outcomes. Hundreds, if not thousands, of studies have been published in this area. Now, that's not to say it's without its limitations. And I think particularly from a social and public policy perspective, there is the risk of victim blaming when you're relying on people to volunteer their own experience. And there's also opportunities for recall bias and that kind of thing, but also in terms of measurement. But also it locates the problem. If we want to solve this problem of racism and how it matters to health, it locates the problem in the dyad, in an interpersonal relationship, or in the mind of the person, the victim, who has to tell you that he or she was discriminated against. So this is the move. It's a big move. It's not moving. It's moving here, but not on the screen. It is moving on the computer, but not on this. That's great. That's where I want to be. Thank you. Okay. So that has been the tradition. The primary focus of research in this area, linking race, racism, and health, is on interpersonal discrimination. A focus on structural and systemic racism as a social determinant of health, instead, or as a complement to, emphasizes that political, social, economic, and cultural systems are interrelated, and Jessica will talk a little bit more about this in a second, and they perpetuate inequitable access to resources and stressors. So society is the problem. It creates a racist structure that privileges opportunity and power for whites and limits resources and opportunities for people of color. And that is a prime driver of racial inequities in health outcomes. And actually, this line of research has been in motion for at least 15 years, as far as I can tell, largely coming out of a sociological and anthropological tradition, but it's gained a renewed sense of urgency, I think, post-2020. And Taylor and some of her colleagues have made some really important contributions in this space. And I think one important implication of focusing on society rather than that interpersonal dyad is that we're all implicit. We're all involved in this. We're all responsible in solving this problem. Jessica, I think you're going to have to use this. There we go. We're not the only ones at IPR who are interested in structural and systemic racism and how it matters to health. So if you haven't seen this great study by Greg and Andy Papachristos and Greg's postdoc Alexis Friedman with Chiari and some other familiar names in the IPR community, they linked health records with neighborhood-based reports of police violence to show that women who lived in neighborhoods with higher levels of police violence had higher rates of preterm delivery and higher risk of cardiovascular disease as they aged. Really, I think, a really important study in this space. And one of the challenges in studying structural racism and how it matters to health is how to operationalize structural racism. It's a complex, multidimensional phenomenon. So there are many different approaches. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now, who's going to share with you an approach we've taken that's explicitly linked to adolescence and the context and experiences that matter most in that phase of the life course. All right, Jessica.
All right. Thanks for that great introduction, Tom. I'm just going to make sure I can see everything here and operate. Okay. So as Tom mentioned, studying structural racism and its impacts on health is really urgent, especially given all of the George Floyd protests since 2020, but it's been an ongoing problem since the times of slavery. Are you having trouble hearing? Okay. Is that better? Great. And it's been an understudied determinant of racial health inequities. So in this study, what we're doing is aligning contexts in which structural racism might be taking place with developmental life stages. So essentially what we're doing is bringing a life course approach to the study of structural racism and health inequities. Using AdHealth data, we'll be looking at the Wave 1 survey from AdHealth and developing a contextual disadvantage index as well as a structural racism index for use within the survey. And then what we do is look at how the CDI, the contextual disadvantage index and structural racism indices predict depressive symptoms in adolescents. And we'll also look at their interaction and the outcomes by race and gender. Oh no. Okay, now it went too far. Okay. So as Thom mentioned, we can think about racism as operating at multiple levels. Most of the research has focused in the last 25 years at understanding interpersonal racism and its relationship with health outcomes. And here, the idea is that interpersonal discrimination represents prejudice that leads to devaluation and lack of respect and dehumanization of one person or group towards another. Another level is at the internalized level. So that's where people internalize these beliefs, these systemic beliefs. And both of these interpersonal and internalized forms of racism are linked to a variety of negative health outcomes, including lower birth weight, hypertension, respiratory problems, diabetes, et cetera. Less work has been done on operationalizing structural racism, but in the last 25 years, a lot of work has been done on theorizing and conceptualizing structural racism. So structural racism as a concept, we can look back at Bonilla Silva in 1997, who thinks about structural racism as the aggregate of social relations and practices based on racial distinctions. And it's pervasive in economic, political, social, and ideological domains. And essentially all of these domains, these systems are hierarchically structured by race in ways that differentially distribute rewards and opportunities. These systems involve institutions, customs, practices, and laws that govern social interactions based on racial distinctions. So this image here is a buckyball and gets at the idea of structural racism as a mutually reinforcing, made up of mutually reinforcing systems. So if each node is a different system, they're all interconnected in ways that even if you try to knock one system out, they are reinforced and reinvented because the other systems sort of support the regenesis. In thinking about racism and health, we can look at this nice schematic about how far, back in history, these socio-historical mechanisms of racism have existed. And, we go back to slavery in the 1600s, which then leads to Jim Crow laws, segregation, redlining, targeting of Black people. And all of these systems have led to a concentration of poverty and social inequities by race. In other words, poor access to healthcare for Black populations, poor housing, schools, and capital. And then of course, all of these inequities and social determinants lead to inequities in health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease and stroke outcomes. So while theory has developed over the last 25 years or so, measurement of structural racism has been a bit trickier. And it's hard to measure because frequently structural racism can be unobservable to the public. We don't necessarily, for example, have records of how private banks make decisions about mortgage lending to be able to measure this. So what we can think about doing is measuring essentially an approximation or a proxy of the aggregate of the interpersonal and internalized racism mechanisms that might be happening. So this also means that there's no single way to measure structural racism. it can be measured in different ways and in different contexts. So this here is an example by Lukashko et al. In 2014, who developed a structural racism index at the state level in various domains. And so these authors looked at Black and white disparities in political participation, employment and job status, educational attainment, and judicial treatment. And as we see here, they find relationships between these forms of structural discrimination and incarceration, employment, state elected officials, and cardiovascular, myocardial infarction. In other studies, including one by our own Carrie Kershaw, structural racism has been conceptualized as racial residential segregation, for instance. And here again, there were positive relationships between racial residential segregation and cardiovascular disease. So structural racism has been less well examined through a life course lens. In particular, we can take a biosocial perspective that suggests that measuring structural racism in the social context that might be most relevant at a particular developmental life stage would be important. So as we can see in this graphic, there are a variety of social contexts that link into human health and development, and these interact with biological processes. And they change across the life course. So social contexts change across life course, and the timing of social exposures are important for the development of human health. In adolescence, which is what we're looking at, schools are particularly important. Adolescence is a sensitive period for the development of social relationships and health trajectories, and schools are the primary context in which adolescents spend their waking time. Teachers, peers, school culture, et cetera, are known to influence various aspects of adolescent development, including psychological well-being. And we also know adolescence is a sensitive period in terms of brain development and behavioral responses. So psychological stressors, chronic social stress, so this would be contextual disadvantage, as well as school structural racism, interpersonal racism, influence brain development in ways that could influence health outcomes, psychological outcomes. Okay, so thinking about racism and school context, there are two different ways in which structural racism might influence racial health inequities. One is, going back to this graphic that dates back to slavery, are the historical processes, including racial segregation, that have disproportionately placed Black students in school contexts of higher disadvantage as compared to white students. And then we can also think about structural racism operating, sort of controlling for these systems that select students into particular schools. We can think about within school structural racism and disparities between Black and white students across various measures within schools. And so we'll be looking at both of these. We'll be using data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, as Thom mentioned. And here we'll be focusing mostly on the various surveys from the initial wave of EdHealth. We bring in measures from School Administrative Survey, from the Student in School Survey, as well as the Wave 1 survey in developing our indices. And then we look at depressive symptoms as an outcome from the Wave 1 survey. And these were fielded when students were about 12 to 20 years old. Okay. So our index measures are the contextual disadvantage index, that's comprised of 20 variables, and the structural racism index, which is comprised of 21 variables. I'll get into why there's a one variable difference in a minute. Our other predictors that are interactive with these indices are race, which we dichotomize as Black only or white only, and gender, which we dichotomize as male and female. Our controls are age, grade, and the school percentage of Black students. And then our outcome measure is depressive symptoms, which is measured in AdHealth as a 19-item CESD questionnaire. Typically, the CESD is 20 questions. For some reason, one question didn't make the cut in AdHealth. But this gives us a range of 0 to 57. And just for reference, typically, mild to moderate depression, the cutoff is 16. With this adjustment, it would be about 15. So these are all of the variables that we bring into our indices, and we group them into 4 different domains. The first domain is student background characteristics. So we bring in info on parental education and whether or not parents work, student body attitudes. So these get at things like perceived life chances and school social cohesion. So whether students feel like they will be married by age 25, will they have a middle class income as adults, whether they feel socially accepted at school. Another domain is the teacher-student racial composition. So we bring this into our structural racism index, but we leave it out of the contextual disadvantage index because we'll be controlling for percentage of students that are Black in schools. And so it doesn't make sense to include it there, but it does get it, the ratio when we move into the structural racism index. And then disciplinary atmosphere. So whether students have ever received an out-of-school suspension. Okay, so then to generate our contextual disadvantage index, what we use is a geometric mean. So to do this, we take our 20 variables. We take first the weighted mean of each variable in each school. So we get 20 school level weighted means. And then we multiply them together and take the 20th root of the product. So theoretically, the geometric mean seems more appropriate than what might typically be used, the arithmetic mean, because it's semi-compensable. So this means that the variables that comprise the index partly compensate for one another in creating the mean, but not entirely. So a surplus value in one variable is unlikely to fully outweigh the deficit in another variable when considering the relationship with adolescent health and well-being. So arithmetic means are fully compensable. That means that something like a disadvantage in school social cohesion would fully compensate for, advantage in school social cohesion would fully compensate for disadvantage in something like parental education, which just seems a little bit more unrealistic. So we go with the geometric mean. We've tested both, but the geometric mean also works better. Similarly, for the structural racism index, we'll also use a geometric mean, but first we take school level means also by race, and then turn them into ratios. So we have a black-white ratio for all of those 21 variables that are in the index. When we're multiplying, of course, we have an issue with using 0 because we would nullify all of our results. So we change that to a small number. And we also substitute 1 for any ratio over 1. Ratios over 1 don't really represent structural racism. These are cases where Black adolescents are doing better than their white peers in schools. And so we cap it at 1, which is also helpful when, because we can get very, very large numbers when we're dividing proportions. So this also allows us to multiply things effectively. And then we go ahead and calculate the geometric mean with the ratios of school variables in each school. Okay. I think it missed one, but that's okay. So we're looking at depressive symptoms as an outcome. We run 3 different models. Our first model looks only at the school contextual disadvantage index. And it's interacted with race and gender so that we can predict depressive symptoms for these different subgroups. And we control for age, grade, and the percentage of Black students. These are linear regression models with cluster robust standard errors, and we're using wave 1 survey weights for the outcome. Our second model looks at the structural racism index and how that associates with depressive symptoms for race and gender subgroups. And this controls for the contextual disadvantage index. So controlling for all of these upstream structural mechanisms that have placed Black students at higher contextual disadvantage, and looking only at these within school Black-white differences in the variables. And then in our third model, we interact the contextual disadvantage index with the structural racism index, first dichotomizing the contextual disadvantage index to make things interpretable. And again, looking at depressive symptoms by subgroup. Okay. And so I'll start with a few summary statistics. This is the school disadvantage index, and we're comparing Black students and white students. And as suspected, we find that the distribution for Black students is skewed to the right. So Black students that are at higher risk of being in higher levels of school contextual disadvantage as compared to white students in the sample. And this looks messy, but these are the 21 variables that go into the structural racism index. And I just want to draw attention to the sample size. So it's down from about 90,000 observations because we have a loss due to a large proportion of white students that are in all white schools. So there's no comparison available with Black students. And I'll also draw attention that the mean is not terribly far from 1 in a lot of these variables, but there's a good amount of variation if we look at the standard deviation. Some additional summary statistics. We have girls on top, boys on the bottom, white students on the left, Black students on the right, and then further broken down by level of disadvantage. And what I'll point out here is just that depression is about 1 point higher in girls, which is in line with previous literature. So this sort of suggests that about half of girls fall into the category of mild to moderate depressive symptoms. Structural racism is also higher among white low disadvantaged populations. This is where we have fewer Black students in these schools, and the percentage of Black students in schools is quite distinct as well. So we'll add in that control. And overall, we have fairly good sample sizes, even in these different subgroups. And then here are some of our results. So these are the marginal effects of the contextual disadvantage index on depressive symptoms. And so we have school contextual disadvantage running across the bottom. And we find that for boys, there's not a huge impact of contextual disadvantage on depressive symptoms. But for girls, there's a pretty steep increase in depressive symptoms across levels of school disadvantage. For Black girls, the slope is a bit higher. It doesn't quite reach statistical significance, but for white girls, it does. So also to note is that, given that Black students are more likely to be in contexts of a higher disadvantaged context, this combined with that location, the increased population helps to explain population level differences, racial differences in depressive symptoms, at least among girls. This is just the regression statistical output. We see that for Black girls, before we add in our controls, it is significant. So it's kind of borderline, but for white girls, it's highly statistically significant. And from our initial sample of about 20,000, we're left with about 12,000 because we lose a lot of sample by looking at only Black students and white students and not other racial groups. Okay. These are the marginal effects of the structural racism index on depressive symptoms. Again, controlling for age, grade, and percentage of Black students in schools. And here we have a suggestive association between structural racism and depressive symptoms among Black girls, and more so for Black boys, which is what we would expect, but it doesn't quite attain statistical significance. But we do actually see for Black boys that the coefficient size increases as we build in additional controls. And then here are our findings for the interaction between school level structural racism and contextual disadvantage. And I will come back to the upper left-hand corner, but we have girls on the top, again, boys on the bottom, Black students on the left, white students on the right. And we see that, for white girls, the relationship between the school racism index and depressive symptoms is relatively flat, regardless of level of contextual disadvantage. Pretty much the same for white boys. There's a suggestive increase for Black boys in high disadvantage contexts where as school level structural racism increases, there's a bit of an uptick in adolescent depressive symptoms. But the really interesting finding is among Black girls. And I will just zoom in on that. So here we see that in low disadvantage contexts, there is quite a steep increase in depressive symptoms with increases in the school structural racism index. And these are highly statistically significant. There's a suggestive bit of decline in high disadvantage contexts, but this doesn't reach statistical significance. Okay. And these coefficients look quite large because I didn't just divide them by 100. So they're essentially representing a move from no structural racism to the highest levels of structural racism in the sample. Our limitations in this study is missingness in the index variables. So we essentially de facto impute these with the mean values. This suggests, given that the individuals missing in some of these samples are more likely to be disadvantaged, that we're actually underestimating contextual disadvantage and structural racism. We also have a limited number of domains. While we're able to incorporate 20 different variables in 4 different domains, this is by no means captures everything about particular school contexts. And we might imagine incorporating a variety of other things that we weren't able to measure. Finally, the geometric mean requires compensatory assumptions. Again, we also tried the arithmetic mean and results were quite similar. So overall, historic processes and structural racism that disparately select students into high disadvantaged schools are associated with higher depressive symptoms. Structural racism within schools is suggestively associated with higher depressive symptoms in Black boys and girls. And school disadvantage and structural racism interact to produce significant, meaningful increases in depressive symptoms in Black girls. And this sort of heterogeneity in results is in line with an intersectionality perspective. So here, an intersectionality perspective suggests that race, class, and gender are important systems of inequality, and they might interact to produce outcomes that are greater than the sum of singular identities. So it leads to expectation that, Black girls and Black boys might have different lived experiences, might have different social roles, a variety of other interactions with racist structures that lead to differential outcomes. And this could help explain heterogeneity in some of our results. And finally, next steps are to apply this index to look at a variety of other outcomes within the Ad Health survey, perhaps looking over time. And to additionally apply this rubric and this life course approach to thinking about how to construct structural racism indices and contextual disadvantage indices in other data sets, perhaps, in other contexts that are particularly relevant to human development and health development at different life stages. And finally, trying to understand what the mechanisms are that might be operating to create these differential outcomes for Black girls and Black boys in these contexts. And that's it. And I have gone far under time compared to what I thought it would be. So we have plenty of time for Q&A.